Good morning, everyone. We are live and on the record right now. So I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm the Chair for Asia-Pacific Security here at the Hudson Institute. We're delighted that we have so many distinguished guests around the room today for what I hope will be a very lively discussion in the first instance on basic principles about strategy between Indonesia and the United States. In this program entitled U.S.-Indonesian Convergence, that's sort of an aspiration, how to better align U.S. and Indonesian Indo-Pacific strategies. And we're very fortunate indeed to have two great initial commentators who are going to help kick off what I hope will be a lively roundtable discussion. Former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the very first one ever for Indo-Pacific Affairs, Randy Schreiber, the Honorable Randy Schreiber, and he's one of the architects of the first ever Indo-Pacific strategy report that was issued last May. Even if that builds on earlier types of policy, it was the public statement coming out of the government, and then followed up by the State Department's document in November as well about a free and open Indo-Pacific advancing shared interest, shows that this is truly trying to be a whole-of-government approach, which is, for the United States, is a challenge, although for Indonesia, whole-of-government approach is even a bigger challenge, perhaps. But we are delighted to have one of the great thinkers and experts, Lieutenant General retired Agus Wijojo, who's the former chairman of the People's Consultative Assembly and the military TNI Chief of Territorial Affairs, among many other accolades. A driving force behind sort of restructuring some of the political and security concepts even within Indonesia, where these issues have a long history. And I must say personally that he has a certain seriousness and depth that comes from probably a very painful personal experience in terms of your father's tragic passing in '65, and that whole historical period in Indonesia has to be a kind of a huge influence on how Indonesia has developed concepts on the military, civil military relations, thinking about strategy, and we'll be hearing a bit about this. I'm going to be very brief here before I turn it over to our two speakers, but I do hope we are able to bring out some of the areas of convergence and divergence that trying to separate these issues out a little bit and delve into secondary and tertiary details about them. A few concepts that I hope we'll think about is that we can distinguish between a concept and a vision. So just how the narratives that may be coming out of the capitals versus all the things we deal with a lot here in Washington, policies, very specific things and budgets. We're interested in both, but it's conscious to trying to get the first principles as well as the policies right. The Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific that we'll hear about from, again, Randy in a minute, also builds on a Japanese concept. There's a proliferation of concepts, in fact, around Indo-Pacific these days, including the ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific, which Indonesia played a key role in. But another area to think about in the conversation is kind of, can we separate Indonesia from ASEAN? On these concepts of Indo-Pacific strategy, and where do they align and where converge and diverge as well in terms of a national identity? So there are a lot of other questions we're going to be able to talk about, and I have many questions myself, but I want to just turn it over right now to Randy Schreiber to informally give us some comments on both the U.S.-Indonesian security relationship that he helped to strengthen, I think, as well as the concepts for the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So Randy's over to you, and I think you can move this mic here if you need it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Patrick, and Hudson Institute, and thanks, General, for joining us, and our friends from the Indonesian Embassy for helping to organize this. This is a very impressive group, so I don't in any way pretend to be the source of all knowledge here. In fact, a couple former ambassadors sitting in front of me, and a lot of experience. So I will stick to my role here, which as Patrick described, sort of root my remarks in the Trump administration Indo-Pacific strategy, sort of reset where we are in the defense relationship, and how really that convergence of vision, concept, but also the strategies we build them out, and will make, I think, for a pretty good future for U.S.-Indonesian relations, and in particular the defense relationship. So just as a reminder, our strategy, and it is a strategy in terms of defined optimal end states, lines of effort, et cetera. But our strategy is focused on the end states of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and what we mean by that are these enduring principles: respect for sovereignty, no matter a country's size, international law and international norms, and respect for those and upholding those, free, fair, and open reciprocal trade, peaceful dispute resolutions, and the like. So our vision is based on these near universal principles, which we think are widely shared. And if you look at the Indo-Pacific outlook, as Patrick said, Indonesia had a huge hand in putting that together. We see a lot of alignment. And so if you look at our strategy, the Indo-Pacific outlook, if you look at what we've put in our bilateral statements, U.S.-Indonesia defense statements, we talk about some of these very same principles. So we see a lot of alignment there. Our strategy has lines of effort, as I said. We refer to it as the 3 Ps. That's our branding, so hopefully people remember the 3 Ps. We talk about preparedness, partnerships and allies, and promoting a networked region. Preparedness is about increasing the lethality of the joint force, but with a purpose, moving away from the types of warfare and the types of conflict we've not only prepared for, but been engaged in for the last couple of decades, and moving into a mindset and preparation for great power competition. So it's a change of mindset, it's a change of investment strategy, it's a change of, potentially a change in posture, et cetera. So as I said, it is with a purpose, thinking about the era of great power competition. And we see Indonesia as a strong partner here in assisting us in our efforts at increasing the lethality of our joint force and the preparedness piece. It's a major exercise partner for us across all services. We have a major Air Force exercise, COPE West, where we have our common platforms, F-16s, for example, participating, which enhances interoperability, but increases our sharpness, our preparedness. We have naval exercise Carrot, which focuses on maritime security. We have major Army exercise Garuda Shield, which we've been expanding in terms of the numbers of soldiers participating. I believe we're up to about 1,500 soldiers. They do small unit tactics, but they also do live fire exercise and airborne operations. So across all services, major exercises, which helps us in our first line of effort. Partners and allies, we do have major and mature alliances in the Indo-Pacific region, but we spend an awful lot of time building out our emerging partners, which are different, obviously, than treaty allies, different commitments and obligations, but in the security environment that we're in now, the partnerships are every bit as important as the allies. If you look at the security challenges running across the broad swath of the whole Indo-Pacific, we need strong partners across the whole region. We're proud, again, Indonesia fits in quite well in this category as well for us. We're proud to be Indonesia's largest military engagement partner. We have about 240 separate engagements a year. So beyond the exercises, we have various exchanges and visits. We have Indonesia participating in IMET. We have new opportunities to engage, for example, with the Kopassus Special Forces Unit, which we had for years self-restricted our ability to interact and do exercising and training. So we're going to initiate some special operations training opportunities there. But it is a very important strategic emerging partner for us, given that level of engagement and what we hope to see even more of. The third P, promoting a networked region, is a recognition that our security challenges in the Indo-Pacific are inherently multilateral, multifaceted, and we are better positioned if our partners and allies and like-minded countries are not only cooperating with us, but are networked with one another. And again, Indonesia is an important part of this. We work with Indonesia on the defense side through what's called the Maritime Security Initiative. MSI is an initiative that helps provide equipment, training, and capability focused on maritime security, so maritime domain awareness and moving countries along the spectrum of seeing, sensing, sharing, and ultimately contributing to maritime security. Again, part of that being not only helping an individual country deal with challenges to their own EEZs and territorial waters, but networking them with other countries so that data can be shared, contacts of interest can be shared, and responses can be collective responses. And Indonesia certainly has challenges in the maritime domain, and so we're proud to be a partner through programs like MSI, but again, it's also aimed at promoting a networked region with other partners. Indonesia, of course, has networks that don't include the United States. The trilateral cooperation between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines is a good example of that. Even if we're not one of the countries in the hyphen, we're willing to be an enabler, a supporter, however the countries involved may see us as being useful. But it, again, contributes to our broader goal, even if we're not in the actual hyphen collection of countries there. So that's how Indonesia, in our view, is a strong partner across all three lines of effort. And again, I think the foundation, it's really rooted in the shared vision and the shared concepts, which are both embedded in our strategies. I think there are other ways we'll see about strengthening our ties. You talked about breaking Indonesia out of ASEAN. I think there are certain ways we can enhance bilateral relations separate and apart from ASEAN, but we don't want to leave the ASEAN piece behind. We conducted our first ever U.S.-ASEAN maritime exercise last fall. Our hope is that that becomes an annual exercise, but if not annual, at least routinized, regularized. But Indonesia played a key role there. We'd like to enhance our bilateral interactions with ASEAN as a whole, and Indonesia is certainly important, if not the most important, certainly one of the leaders there. There are a number of areas beyond training and exercise, real-world practical cooperation we're engaged in. We do a lot of work in the area of counterterrorism. I think Indonesia does quite well in terms of dealing with the domestic challenges there, but as the international picture becomes more complicated and the potential for return of foreign fighters or dispersal of foreign fighters, if you will, working with Indonesia and the international community to have our hands around that, I think is increasingly important and something that we're certainly committed to doing. Indonesia has initiatives like the Our Eyes initiative. We're a supporter of that, again, even if we're not always a direct participant, but helping with that networking and helping deal with the real-world challenges of counterterrorism is something that we're certainly interested in doing. So if that's enough to sort of baseline and get us started.
Very much. Thank you very much, Randy. You know, a free and open Indo-Pacific, an inclusive free and open Indo-Pacific, it seems like there's a lot of symmetry potentially here with Indonesia, but why don't we just listen to General Wijojo's opening comments here, and then we'll join these two together. Please, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kroenen. Yes, and let's see, Honorable Randall Shriver, as my partner speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this very distinguished forum. I have heard whispers that not only that I did not expect to have a big turnout and very high quantity and very high quality turnout. But it seems that it was not only me who was surprised, but there are also some other American friends who are also surprised. Uh, yes. My task here is to present a presentation which will enrich the presentation that had previously been given by Honorable Mr. Render Shriver. And I will try to stick into the title, which is How to Better Align US and Indonesian Indo-Pacific Strategies in the US-Indonesian Convergence. So talking about strategy, the strategy that I will be referring to would be national strategy, which is not only limited to security strategy, but national strategy, comprising of the various national instruments of power, with the military as only one of those instruments. There are other instruments such as economics, especially diplomacy, where we would see in this issue a major role to play. And also that the principles of strategy would be put into practice to adjust to the situation as to where do we put the main focus of the strategy and where do we put the supporting strategy, and be flexible with the various strategies where at any point in time where the situation deems necessary, we can switch the primary strategy into supporting and the supporting into the primary strategy. Now, about the region. By the way, I have given a presentation yesterday at, where was it?
Rand Corporation.
Oh, RAND Corporation, and I also attended the dinner, gala dinner by Yusindo, and there it was presented the results of the talks made by the delegation led by coordinating Minister of General Luhut Panjaitan with very high U.S. dignitaries, and that it was a very positive, which would be interesting to see how it implies into changing the landscape of the strategic dynamics in the region. And I would say that things that we have discussed at RAND Corporation yesterday and I presented would not be valid anymore with the result of the talks that had been made by the General Luhut's delegation yesterday. Yes, as you may all have known, that the position of Indonesia in its foreign policy have always been consistent into several principles. First, that it should be based on the international international-based order, and that every responsible state involved would have to adhere to the international-based order. It would have to be in the context of norm setting, and by applying a habit of negotiation and dialogues, meaning that we would not support any conflict resolution by force, and it would have to be resolved by negotiation and consensus, and based on the principles also of transparency and inclusivity. Is it inclusivity or inclusiveness? I don't know. But what is it really that Indonesia would like to see to be established in the region? First is that there should be, Indonesia would like to see regional stability. And also, in line with that, it would be the two sides of a coin with regional prosperity, the development of regional prosperity. And Indonesia have not given up the ideals of ASEAN when it was established, and to try to establish the region as the zone of peace and neutrality. Now, we see that the region is also a conflicting ground of the two current powers, basically starting from the economic conflict between the the economic superpower of the US and the rising power of China, and that poses the question of how Indonesia deals with China. First is that Indonesia would look or seek for any possibilities of mutual benefit with China, of common interest and any shared interest, which would have to take the form in implementation of an economic and trade cooperation, and that we would also enhance the aspect of people-to-people link rather than rely on the formality of government to government. And as we have paid notice or concern with the development of China in the region, which tends to send the signal of becoming more assertive, then what would Indonesia have in place in the situation of facing China, which is becoming more assertive? First of all, is that Indonesia is part of the China Plus, together with actually with China itself, Japan, and South Korea. Indonesia would mobilize the state actors and member states of China Plus to sit down and talk over the issue. And next, also Indonesia have the instrument of the East Asia Summit. That would include the US, China, ASEAN partners, and India. The ASEAN Regional Forum, which specifically talks about security, is still in place, and that again could be invited for their contribution to try to find peaceful solution or to establish the purpose of the ideas of the vision of the region. Then what strategy would Indonesia adopt? Generally, Indonesia would adopt the hedging strategy in the Indo-Pacific, and that Indonesia is aware that there is a very distinctly different approach to the overlapping area of what we call the 9-dash line. It is not a matter of sovereignty. It is an area of zone of exclusive economic zone of Indonesia. So it is not an area within the sovereignty of Indonesia. So it is not unlike other claimant states like the Philippines and other states in Southeast Asia. It is not part of the Indonesian sovereignty, but there is also that sovereign rights of the Indonesia to exploit the resources of the exclusive economic zone, and that although it is open for partners to establish activities there. Of course, only with the consent of Indonesia, and because of the differences that realistically we do not see any hopes to be resolved in the near future. Why is that? Because Indonesia would see the arrangement and structure of the various national maritime areas based on the United Nations laws of the seas, the UNCLOS, while China sees its right in the area from their historical perspective. Now they're using the term of traditional fishing grounds for their fishermen. And that would be a too contrastingly much the opposite of perspective. So that, again, if we just rely on the direct strategy with hard power, it may be counterproductive, and it may lead into possibilities of misperception. So that Indonesia also have prepared the supporting strategy, and which we would see would play a dominant role because of the situation that I've mentioned, and that is diplomacy. Indonesia would place the main strategy on diplomacy. The purpose of the diplomacy is hopefully to be able to establish opportunities for shared interest, which would open for cooperation, and hopefully would die away from the strong overlapping claims. Yes, these are without challenges, and the challenges is that this is not only a situation of a situation of conflict between two states only, but here also we see the role of the United States. So it is much more in the mathematics of the trilateral maintenance of shared interest between Indonesia, the United States, and China. And next, it would also that Indonesia is still focusing on ASEAN as Indonesia's cornerstone of the regional policy, which requires, again, common perspectives on regional issue, in which we cannot take for granted is being shared by member states of ASEAN, and where we have to work for that. And this can be also be seen as one of the implementation of the principle of inclusivity or inclusiveness. Okay. I must have missed that in my school.
It's
that requires hard work on establishing confidence-building measures amongst those involved or related regional players. And because this is called the Indo-Pacific strategies, the next question which arises would be the question, what is the role for India? India has a specific and maybe an isolated situation in their relationship with China outside in the whole context of the Indo-Pacific challenges. That would put influence as, to India's position in making that contribution into the Indo-Pacific strategies. As we all know, expansion of Chinese influence into South Asia will pose us new dynamics, which can influence India to have a feel of uncomfortability in their comfort zone. And next would be which can provide into the comfort of Indonesia, of India, I mean, as a comfortable sub-regional powers in the past. India will have to be embraced as the strategic partner to make its contribution in establishing a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific, to balance China, and specifically, India has a sort of a dominant role to play in the South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And so that would be a sort of a broad brush of the Indonesian position, trying to address all the aspects related to Indo-Pacific strategies and how to better align U.S. and Indonesian in the Indonesian Indo-Pacific strategies. And by that, I look forward to our discussion and comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. We've got a lot on the table already. I wonder if I could just ask a first question about the Indonesian reaction to the American national security strategy and the Trump administration, from which the Indo-Pacific strategy flows. That is, the new priority placed on major power competition. Because I think therein is a lot of the tension between the Indonesian and American perception. The concepts of order, the desired order, may not be that different in terms of the aims. But given the fact that Indonesia, with its fragmented governance, limited power projection, strong desire for Chinese investment, and its principles that always want to come back to cooperation, diplomacy, consensus as a way to deal with tension, we're now confronting you with this reality that you can't really just do that anymore. That strategy may no longer work. Look at Cambodia in ASEAN in 2012. They ran the other way when it came to South China Sea on the communique. Look at China's so-called gray zone activity and political warfare. Think about their information sort of subversion and techno-nationalism as well. It's not just the traditional Natuna Island question. It's this new dimension that plays, I think, on deep fears in Indonesia about the vulnerabilities of how do you keep this archipelagic country together when you're so vulnerable. But I'm throwing this out to be provocative because I'm trying to get to a major point of, is there a tension here or not? And I'd be very interested to hear Randy Shriver's sort of thought about why there's more convergence here than there looks, maybe. Please, do you have a reaction to that?
Yes.
And then we'll open it up.
Was that the first question?
That was the first question, yes. I'm going to stop there. I could ask many, but we're going to open it up around the table. There's a lot of expertise.
Thank you. You're confronting me with a pile of various aspects of the issues now. Yes, especially under President Trump administration with its policy of America First. It poses some anxiety within the other countries and states, especially if we talk about the Indo-Pacific region. The concrete question there would be, what does it mean for Indo-Pacific states, and how does that translate into the implementation of U.S. foreign policy in the region? And what's in it for us? That is one, I think, and second would be China is very aggressive and assertive in developing their influence around the region. And if the U.S. does not balance the assertiveness and the charm offensive of China, then it would only pose limited alternatives for the states in the region. Now, as I've said, the result of the talks between Pak Luhut's delegation yesterday, I think, would change that landscape, and it would be interesting to see how things will develop in the future, because that policy will balance the policy of China, and which makes it a better a balance to the Chinese charm offensive. Is there any other questions that I have not answered?
Well, I think we can't, these are not to be answered with finality.
Okay.
I mean, I think
Yes.
we're trying to have a conversation.
Right.
Thank you. I mean, it seems to me, though, there's
Sorry,
not-
sorry for my military background, because in military background there are questions and answers. In diplomacy, no answer is good enough.
That's right. Well, Randy, over to you.
Just a quick few points. So we've always been careful to say China is a competitor, not an enemy, not an adversary. The relationship has always been a blend of competition and cooperation. I think primarily because of China's behavior, the competitive aspects have come more to the fore, and that's characterizes the relationship overall more than the cooperative aspects. So within that framework, we still maintain very robust relations with China ourselves, including military and defense relations. The year our Indo-Pacific, our national defense strategy was released, where we declared China a strategic competitor, was one of the more robust years we had in the military relationship with China. It was the first time ever in one calendar year we had a defense secretary visit China and a defense minister from China visit the United States in the same calendar year. So we have at no point said there's a choice between the United States and China, although I think it's actually China's narrative to promote that's what we're trying to force countries to do. So at no point do we say you shouldn't have a strong relationship with China, you shouldn't have close economic ties. So that's point number one. Point number two, to the extent there is a choice, we continue to say that it's choice between principles and values and the qualities that'll define the region. So we do think there's a choice between a vision where international law and norms are undermined, where there's less freedom of maneuver in the regional commons, versus our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, which again is based on what we believe are near universal principles. So that's the choice, really. Can you choose protection of your own sovereignty? Can you choose protection of international law and norms? If you can choose those things, which we think most countries can do, then we think you'll largely be on sides with us, because that's what we're trying to promote. Number three, I think if you think about the balancing and if it's really a choice of trying to stay in between and not do things that could upset China, think about where you're going to be asked to make accommodations. We know the Chinese are very much against our efforts to build out a Quad, which, if you recall, US, India, Australia, Japan, the Quad was founded on December 26, 2004, after the great tsunami tragedy in Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia, for humanitarian purposes. One would wonder what the Chinese would say about our efforts to build out some trilateral cooperation between the United States, Indonesia, and Australia. We'd like to see, for example, our presence in Darwin leveraged for the United States and Australia to do more outreach with Indonesia. I suspect the Chinese would not like to see that. So if you think about the balancing where the trade-offs are, that can be a pretty risky proposition, I think, in terms of what you'd be cutting yourselves off from.
Well, we've got a great lineup of questions, and Murray, I think your tent was up first.
Thanks, Patrick. General Guerrero, I really appreciate your comments, but you said a few things that I want to just press on a little bit further, if possible. You alluded to what Dr. Hood said yesterday at the U.S.-Indo dinner. One of the, or in his talks yesterday, actually. And one of the things that he raised in the dinner was that he was hoping to negotiate infrastructure, some infrastructure projects to announce when President Jokowi comes to visit. And there's also an implication that maybe President Jokowi will not only go to Vegas, but also come to Washington, which would be interesting because I've gotten the impression from Indonesia that they didn't want to necessarily come this year in an election year, and Indonesia also hasn't been terribly impressed with the Trump Jared Middle East peace process, and so I was curious as to where you saw that. But I also want to just quickly follow up on the tuna. What do you think China was doing there in December? It comes, they did that, 2016 also, but what's different is this time is it came in the context of having spent, 3 or 4 months harassing the Vietnamese off Vanguard, and same amount of time harassing the Malaysians off Sarawak, and then they had harassed the Philippines on fisheries the year before pretty seriously. Are they saying to you that, they seem to be saying to the Vietnamese and Filipinos, you can't develop this, the Vietnamese and Malaysians, you can't develop this oil and gas without working with us. You can do it yourself or with us, but you ain't doing this with Shell and Rosneft and all those evildoers. Sorry, those other companies. So I'm wondering if they're telling you that that's they say it's their historic fishing ground, but I'm wondering how you see what they were what the message they were sending you in December. Thanks.
Could you clarify the question?
Well, I think we're all curious as to why China was so assertive over the Natuna fishing grounds. What's behind what the China? How does Indonesia see what's behind China's current or recent assertiveness on this issue? We saw the diplomacy played out, where your president made an issue of it, and then kind of said, "Well, it's not an issue because there are no fishing boats in there at the moment." But unlike 2016, this was preceded by a good deal of assertiveness against the claimants, especially Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And yes, non-claimant, sovereign rights, not sovereignty. But at the same time, you've been grouped by China by action in this same group, seemingly. So how does Indonesia interpret that? What is China doing?
What is China doing? I think it falls into the same groupings of strategy, how China views whether there are overlapping sovereignty rights, sovereignty over sovereignty, or just the exclusive economic zone in Indonesia. The difference is only in the status of the overlapping areas. That on Indonesia, it's not about sovereignty. For other countries, it's about their principal rights of sovereignty. And I think that does not distinguish in the difference of the Chinese behavior towards those states. So from the Indonesian perspective, we just have only to observe and anticipate as to when will China act maybe to provoke Indonesia, and that when they claim that the maritime waters north of Natuna Island as their traditional fishing ground, and that they backed up their fishermen with Coast Guard vessels. I think it was a psychological play of diplomacy to say that why do we use our Coast Guard? Because we consider it as part of our national territory. And with that, by that, Indonesia tries to play from the moderate level, and it seems that if we analyze from the anatomy of the issue, it seems that the approach through diplomacy would be more effective, although the essence of the issue, I don't think it is very much different from the issue between China and other countries compared to the issue between China and Indonesia.
But, yeah, and I think the tension here is, China is pressing its claims, which is fair enough, all right, that's how they're doing, what they're doing. But would they stop Indonesia from actually exploiting the resources, the energy, the way they've sort of stood in vanguard? And I think that's a question mark, and it's a question of risk and fear, the perception here of where China, and we'll try to get a little deeper into this as we ask questions. I've got, please, yes, go ahead.
To finish up on what the general response is.
Oh,
What the significance.
what the significance, all right, you've alluded to the significance of General Hu. Why is it significant? I didn't hear, I just returned from Europe last night.
Yes.
Okay.
The value of the significance is that maybe in the near past, we have not yet received any signals from the United States of their attention to respond to the concern of the United States to Indonesia. For instance, that when there was a what was it, ASEAN summit, was it?
ASEAN US Summit.
The last
Bangkok, yeah.
one, yes, okay.
President Trump, just passed those member states of ASEAN and did not pay a visit into any of those member states. Whereas maybe in the Asian culture, the appearance of one symbolizes or sends messages as to how the U.S. is interested in the region. And with the result of yesterday's talks, I think it is a new step in the direction of the U.S. attention and concern to Indonesia, which allows Indonesia to have a more maneuverable room to have alternatives rather than only to turn to China as the main provider of maybe investment that Indonesia needs.
I don't think there's anybody in this room who didn't regret the lack of showing up at Bangkok, but that's, and including Randy Schreiber when he was Assistant Secretary, but I won't put words in his mouth. Lieslotte, please.
Thank you. I have a question for Randy.
Yes.
So there is a tension, as Patrick mentioned, between the U.S. seeing China as a competitor and Indonesia seeing China as, more complicated regional challenge. And that is shared with a lot of other countries, including Japan, at least the Americans are not present in my view, but also Europe and others. How do you overcome that in your strategy? It seems to me that the economic part could be the solution, because everyone is interested in providing alternatives to China's Belt and Road, et cetera. But there is also the concern, even from the Japanese who are quite active, that it's a lot of rhetoric and we're not able to provide an alternative. Can you speak to that? Can you point to things that you see happening on the ground that will actually provide a real alternative, or is it just rhetorical stuff? And also you said that countries do not have to choose, but it seems to me that things like the digital part, you do want people to choose. So there are parts of this, which is where the Chinese alternative is taking a strong foothold in Southeast Asia, where you do wish people to choose. How do you overcome that tension? And for you, I'd like to ask about the Code of Conduct negotiations. I find it hard to see how you can find a diplomatic solution. Lately, China has said that they want to rewrite the whole innocent passage script, and you're alone in that. You don't really negotiate or draw on other countries in your negotiations. Do you see a role for third parties in providing assistance to ASEAN, or do you think it's a good process just to negotiate with China? And if so, how do you see a reconciliation produced between ASEAN's views and China's views? And ASEAN is a complex size in itself because there are some China dependents within that group. So, yeah, I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, just briefly, because I think it does sort of relate to the previous question about seeing China as a competitor versus an adversary or enemy. We don't go to countries and say you shouldn't have close economic ties, you shouldn't have a good relationship, because we want the same with China, and so we don't demand anything different from one of our partner countries. I think the question about providing alternatives is a very fair one. I think if I were to critique the Trump administration, I would say we're slow out of the gates in terms of getting our policy in order with respect to trade and economics and development assistance. We pulled out a TPP, promised bilateral trade agreements, and we didn't produce any for the majority of the administration's tenure. So we did a repeal but not a replace. We're starting to get our act together. I think working with Congress on the BUILD Act to create the Finance Development Corporation and resourcing it at $60 billion is a good start. I think we're not going to match BRI type figures, but that's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to provide high quality, transparent, and impactful types of economic cooperation. And also we can approach it as partnerships with other development assistance partners. So whereas we can't necessarily unilaterally match BRI, we can partner with Japan, Australia, India, others to have either collective efforts or division of labor that we can come closer to matching BRI, but in fact, the high quality nature of our assistance should more than compensate for the difference in the actual dollar amounts. So I think that's our challenge. I think we're on a better track now, but I think it's a very fair point that we've got to have the alternatives. On the discrete points where we ask for countries to choose, I think within this competitive environment there are discrete choices to make, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're saying choose a relationship with the United States or choose a relationship with China. But on 5G, for example, if you want the kind of close cooperation, the ability to share sensitive information and intelligence, there is a discrete choice we're going to ask countries to make. If they make other decisions, it's not the end of the relationship or the end of the world, but it could impact the nature of our cooperation, and that's just a fact.
Indeed. So, I mean, I think Indonesia doesn't want to see China just posed as a source of instability, but also as an opportunity. And I think Randy's saying, yes, we are pursuing opportunities as well, although there's a shift in priority in terms of dealing with the competition. And you're getting a question now on the code of conduct where it seems like China's using engagement on a code of conduct as a type of competition in reality. And look what they're doing. So, you know, Indonesia's not facing up to the competition. America's maybe being too focused on the instability side of China's competition. I'm just trying to bring these concepts closer together and see whether there's more room in the middle. Because I think infrastructure and where we spend our money will speak loudly about our priorities. And that's why I hope next month, and yes, you know, maybe bet on black at the roulette wheels in Nevada and maybe come to Washington and get some infrastructure. But General, please.
Yes. Yes. We see the establishment of code of conduct as, again, a viable instrument in lieu of a direct confrontation in trying to solve the problem. And that is reflected very well on the principles of code of conduct, which are, amongst others, the most important. First is to avoid high politics. Second is, forefronting low politics as the contrary, and respect of sovereignty of other countries. Also, by the same time, establishing mutual trust, which is the content of the code of conduct. And also, we need mechanics for that. So we try to establish that the half-track diplomacy as a vehicle. So it's just another way of trying to find concrete modalities to open communications and to seek opportunities for shared purposes in which we can collaborate commonly. So that is also in line with what I've said, that with diplomacy as our main thrust of the way that we try to find resolution to the issue.
Very good. I want to get all of our discussants in here, so we're going to ask more than one question maybe at a time here. Brian was next, and then I've got the big three across from me, but we'll have to break this down and ask a couple of questions at a time maybe, rather than, I think four would be too many. Brian, you're next. And then the first of the three here can decide which one wants to ask a question as well. Then we'll come to the next two, please.
Thanks, Patrick. My question is for the general. And I believe I'm paraphrasing correctly one of your statements during your presentation, that you said if there's no U.S. balance to China's charm offensive or an effective U.S. charm offensive, then this is going to change U.S.-Indonesia's relationship. So my question ties into what Dr. Ogard and Murray asked on kind of the non-military side of the Indo-Pacific strategy. We've seen a lot of programs come out. Randy mentioned the BUILD Act, the DFC reform, more funding for infrastructure and energy projects. And infrastructure and energy approach gets talked about a lot here in Washington these days. So my question to you is what you've seen of the new programs coming out of Washington, out of this administration, is this ample to initiate a charm offensive, I guess, from the United States? And what are we missing as far as what Indonesia needs?
Hold that thought. Which one of you would like to go first? I didn't know which one put the ten up. Please, Ambassador Roy.
Actually, I wanted to make some comments.
Please, that's all right. That's entitled.
On the discussion. This is a really important topic, and I think Randy, you and General Joyo really got us off to an excellent start in their comments. But I've been thinking ever since you announced this event, you know, where are the areas of convergence between U.S. approaches to the Indo-Pacific and Indonesia's approach, and where are the problem areas? I see immense possibilities for cooperation, but I also see some sensitive areas that I think we need perhaps to pay a little more attention to. On the cooperation area, I think the strategic issue of most importance is that both China and both the United States and Indonesia do not wish to see East Asia dominated by China. China historically has never dominated maritime Asia. And what is shaping up to a significant degree is a competition between maritime Asia and China's strategic interests now, which are unsatisfied by the fact that they do not have a position in maritime Asia. They don't control the island chains. They're dependent on the access routes to the Indian Ocean where Indonesia and Malaysia are vitally important. And China's strategy is going to be to improve its ability to influence those considerations, and Indonesia is the key country in this respect. But if we look at the maritime portion now, we can already see that the Philippines is a weak link because of the way that they are handling China, as opposed to Japan and Indonesia in the south. So this is an area where we need to be thinking strategically, because China is thinking about becoming a global naval power, and that means it needs bases, it needs assured access through the straits and other things, and there are lots of areas where there can be strategic competition in those areas, in which Indonesia is really important. Second issue is the South China Sea. And here I think we have made enormous mistakes in treating China as a unitary actor. The fact of the matter is China does not have a consistent policy on the South China Sea. They have an internal dispute that is so sensitive they can't resolve it. They were a major factor in negotiating the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but the Navy and the maritime interests, the fisheries and other people, do not accept the conditions of the law of the sea. And if we track Chinese statements on the subject from, say, 2012 until the present time, we can already see that in 2012, the Foreign Ministry was the spokesperson for the law of the sea, and they expressed their claims in terms of land areas and adjacent waters, which is consistent with the law of the sea. But in terms of the behavior patterns, it's quite clear that the Navy and the maritime fishery interests, et cetera, are not prepared to operate within that framework. They want the 9-dash line to represent traditional waters of China, where China has special rights. So with respect to environment issues, with respect to fisheries issues, with respect to pollution issues, China is asserting the right to be the police person for the South China Sea, and that has gotten it's made the tuna issue more sensitive, because the 9-dash line is ambiguous as to whether it involves Natuna, but China traditionally treated Natuna as outside its claims, in which the bottom line is the 4-degree line. But there is overlap with the exclusive economic zone. China is now beginning to assert fishing rights, traditional fishing rights, but under the law of the sea, you can assert traditional fishing rights, but you can't exercise them except in agreement with the country that has the exclusive economic zone. And China has not yet seemed to be willing to negotiate. So there's a real issue there. But the real problem from the U.S. standpoint is most of the countries of the region want diplomacy to deal with the problems in the South China Sea, and we have tended to keep our military in the forefront. The problem with that is it has increased the role of the Chinese Navy as the spokesperson for the Chinese position on the South China Sea, and the Chinese Navy's position is hostile to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So this is an area where China and where the United States and Indonesia have room for cooperation, but we've got to recognize that Indonesia will be pushing diplomacy, and we will be thinking in terms of our naval access and the frequency of operations and things of this sort. So it's a tricky area. Additional area for cooperation has to do with anti-terrorism, especially the issue of returned fighters. But this is a tricky area. because it touches on an area that we have to keep in the back of our minds. Indonesia is the most moderate country with a majority Muslim population in the world, I would argue. But at the same time, Muslims in Indonesia consider the United States prejudiced against Islam because of our support for Israel. And while it doesn't take the active form that it does in many other countries, it is an underlying problem whenever anything involving Islamic countries is involved. So issues such as the propagation of Wahhabism, the issue of the return fighters, all of this involves working with a country with a majority Muslim population in which we are seen as being ill-disposed toward Islam. And that is an area which has to be handled with great sensitivity, it seems to me, on both sides. I think it's come out in the discussion here. We underfund our diplomacy in East Asia now. We have not been, the president of Indonesia expressed interest in joining TPP. We pulled out of TPP without even giving any study to the issue, leaving Indonesia high and dry in terms of the desire of the East Asian countries en masse not to be dominated economically by China. And TPP was our principal instrument for strengthening our economic role in the region, and we have pulled out of it and have nothing to substitute for it. So this is an area where we in Indonesia, we saw the kernels in the comments last night of the potential for doing something in this area, but at the moment it's not being done. We're merely looking at the question. Another very important issue is Indonesia has a long common border with, water border with Australia, one of our principal allies in the region. So therefore, the state of Indonesia's relationships with Australia is of considerable importance to us. And yet, probably our best way of handling it is stay out of it, because Australia and Indonesia have been remarkably successful, given their very different cultural natures, at working out a modus vivendi that works very well. Indonesia's tradition of non-alignment is something we have to keep in our minds. Suharto in 1995 shocked everybody by negotiating a security arrangement with Australia, which in a sense was the first breach in the traditional non-alignment posture, but that has gone nowhere. And the undercurrent of Indonesia is always wanting to not get completely aligned with dominant powers is something we have to take into account, because my sense is that in this administration in particular, the instinct is to want alignment. And we've got to be careful in dealing with Indonesia, which is the most significant country in Southeast Asia, in handling those types of issues. So these are areas where I think that there are enormous room for cooperation, but also there are some very sensitive areas that have to be handled with real attention. And I haven't put this in terms of a question, but General, if you have disagreement with the way I have put things, I'd be very interested in hearing your views on it.
So, a response to Ambassador Roy as well as to Brian Eiler's question about what's missing on the non-military side of cooperation in general. Both of you may have something to say, but I think you've been encouraged by Ambassador Roy to agree entirely with everything he said, or take some exception, or add on to it.
Yes, I very much share of what you mentioned during your presentation. Southeast Asia, with all the states in the region, has historically existed in a very specific way with strong characteristics from the individual states. Very much different from the composition that we see maybe in Europe, which could be more easily to be integrated into a union or unity. In Asia, it's different. each state has its own historical background, different culture, and moreover, adding to that is has their own pride in their culture. Yes, it is a very complicated issue. It's not a black and white to support or not to support, to be allies or not to be allies. They can be supportive in one aspect, while in another aspect, any of those states have differences. And I think that only supports one of the classic or universal tenets in international relations or politics, that all politics is local, that Indonesia is being has to consider of how they would like to pursue in their international relations, but they have also to consider of their domestic political aspirations, and where right now the situation is much different of what we see maybe 15 or 20 years ago, where outside influence about Islam can be limited, and we can still see a highly distinctive, a strong characteristic of moderate Islam of Indonesia. Current situation is different, and where domestic policies can easily mix into international politics, which makes the government not that easy to establish their policies, especially in foreign policies. I share most of your comments, Ambassador. Thank you.
A general who speaks like a diplomat. So, Randy, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just briefly, and I very much appreciate the comments. On the point about counterterrorism and navigating the sensitive areas and the perception of the United States, certainly I understand discomfort with our policy towards Israel, and I understand discomfort toward our president because of many of his comments and policies. On the other hand, the places where Muslims are most stressed and under duress and oppressed, the United States has a much stronger record than all of Southeast Asia. For example, support for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I mean, perhaps the general can comment, but we've been very vocal, and we've been very strident in our efforts to highlight the problems there. There's almost nothing coming out of Southeast Asia. The Rohingya were the largest contributors to the refugees. Bangladesh, of course, is carrying the greatest burden with the 600,000, but we're the largest financial contributor to support the refugees. Not as much coming from Southeast Asia. So I think it would be fair to ask we'd be judged on our entire record, and I think we're much stronger on some of these other areas. So
I wasn't being critical, I was just trying to highlight.
Yeah.
There is a, I found that the instructions I got on any issues involving the Islamic world from Washington were worthless.
Yeah.
Because they were based on the assumption that the country shared our attitude on an issue involving Islam, and the fact of the matter is, they didn't.
Yeah.
And so you had to restructure them in such a way that the presentation didn't make it look as though Islam is bad, and Saddam Hussein. Indonesians didn't like Saddam Hussein, but he was the head of an important Islamic country. And somehow that didn't come through in the way that we structured our instructions.
Sure. Just briefly on the South China Sea, I get the point that the face of it looks a little more militarized because of the freedom of navigation. I wonder, your comment that they're not unitary and that there maybe seams that can be exploited. I think the Obama administration did quite well in Asia, and they did very well in the relationship with Indonesia. I think one of the areas of weakness was the South China Sea, and I think when there was a period where there was a reluctance to do more FONOPs, a reluctance to do more challenges to the excessive claims, that's where we saw the Chinese be most assertive of all. right, with the land reclamation and the militarization of the South China Sea and more assertiveness. So I'm not sure I would agree that our sort of enhancing the military response, there's a causal effect there. I think it was an appropriate response given what we saw over the previous decade or so, and when we were, I think, more reluctant on the military side is where the Chinese were most aggressive.
Time is running out, so I want to get each of you to at least say something briefly with your name tin up here. And I think Gabby, Mike, you were next, and Ambassador Blake, go ahead and say something, even though you just put your tent down.
No, I will. I thought you were going to call
Okay,
it.
well, no, go ahead. Ambassador Blake, and then Emma McDevitt, and then we'll go to Gabby and Zach, and then we'll just go back for a final word from our two speakers.
I have 2 points. One, a very simple question for the general. Is the agreement that it was much in the press last year with India to grant the Indian Navy access to Sabah Island in Aceh province, is that a real issue, or are the Indians actually building a pier, or Indonesia building a pier where Indian warships could call, et cetera? So what's happening there, essentially? And the second one is, Ambassador Roy addressed it, but I'm not sure who it was that said Indonesia is looking for leverage, or doesn't have many options. And it seems to me Indonesia has a lot of options, and it has unique leverage. Not only its size, but the leverage is named Malacca, Lombok, and Sunda, the 3 straits that connect the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and where most of China's trade flows. And so it seems to me the leverage you have is China must certainly be aware, but it wouldn't hurt if somebody mentioned it to them that it's not a good idea to irritate the person who sits aside the straits in which all of your trade travels. And so it strikes me, does Indonesia quietly and subtly and maybe in its Javanese way remind China that they are really, their trade is held hostage to their good behavior through otherwise passage through the Indonesia Straits could become very difficult?
A great question. Ambassador Blake?
India.
I have a similar question, which is, Agus, I think underlying a lot of this discussion has been that there's a gap between Indonesia's stated policy of the importance of diplomacy, ASEAN centrality, and what is actually happening on the ground, which is that China is steadily eating ASEAN's lunch, to put it bluntly. And, I think there's been very little progress, for example, on the code of conduct over the last 5 years. And, of course, there was the famous International Court decision on the Philippines, which was largely ignored, and so forth. I was ambassador sort of in the transition from SBY to President Jokowi. And under SBY, you saw very, very active Marty Natalegawa, and even President SBY himself, on ASEAN issues. And Marty was personally involved in trying to negotiate the code of conduct and move it forward. We haven't really seen very much from Indonesian diplomacy in the last 5 years on ASEAN, and certainly not on the code of conduct. And yet, Indonesia is the leader of ASEAN, so if anybody's going to really make a difference, it needs to be Indonesia. So I just, as Ambassador Roy said, the Chinese are steadily moving south and into Indonesia's territory, and unless there's pushback from ASEAN and Indonesia, they're just going to continue to do that and assert their rights. So I would argue that it's more important than ever for Indonesian diplomacy to sort of step up in the ASEAN context and, first of all, negotiate a code of conduct, but also, to be a little bit, to sort of assert some red lines.
And 2 final comments before we return.
General Jojo, I'm Gabby Burrell. I'm at the Australian Embassy. I'm our Defence Policy Lead. And I wanted to highlight your point about having a vision for the region. We've just had a state visit from your president, and he very much focused on, while we were discussing cooperation on the Indo-Pacific, even some enhanced cooperation in the South Pacific. He also brought it back up to that overall vision and the way in which economic cooperation, even the education of our young people and the exchanges that happen between them plays back into our security. So just highlighting that important point that you made about looking at all what we do across the board together. And just going to Mr. Shriver's point about a networked region, we've had a defence cooperation plan with Indonesia since 1968. Thank you, Ambassador Roy, for your comments about our relationship. And really, from our perspective, as Mr. Shriver was talking, you know, those priorities around maritime security, around countering terrorism, the Our Eyes initiative, and also the Marines in Darwin, which is very much about improving cooperation between Australia, the US and the region. We have an open invitation for Indonesian defence people to visit, and we're very, very keen to explore opportunities, as we always are with Indonesia, in terms of what more can we do together. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Zakabu's the last comment from.
Just a quick question. The President and the Cabinet announced this week that they will not take back some 669 foreign fighters. Was that a good decision? Was that good politics? Or was that effective counterterrorism? How does it help Indonesia to have a group of people operating outside the country where they are able to plan and support groups within Indonesia? How does it help Indonesia to have a large number of children that are radicalized outside? How does it help Indonesia to not have a controlled return of these people?
Well, we've got a great set of questions and comments, and I want to turn.
I'll do something very un-American and cede all my time.
Okay.
I think all the questions were for the general, so I don't need to make any closing.
General.
Yes. We lack balance of questions addressed to Randy.
Well, I know, but, I mean, Sabang, for instance, is there any, when Pak Lohut went to India, I think they announced there was going to be this access to Sabang, and then they backed off and they said, well, there may be some infrastructure support. But it goes along with, Admiral McDevitt's question about leverage on the 3 choke points. Sabang is obviously key for the Andaman Sea and the Indian influence there. So that's another obvious area of cooperation. But does Jakarta have, cold feet about too much cooperation with India? Or are you doing something with India on this issue? Or is it all going to happen under the umbrella of infrastructure because it won't upset the neighborhood?
Yes, as cooperation with India, it is being accommodated as part of the, what is it, IORA?
IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association.
Yes, Indian Ocean Rim Association, which has been quite recently established. And hopefully that could accelerate in our speed to speed up our cooperation with India, and not only based on the bilateral relations between Indonesia and India. Although that there are some concrete challenges out on the ground that infrastructures have to be enhanced or improved, especially on the western part of Indonesia in its naval infrastructures. Okay. Then on ASEAN, Ambassador, I thought you were on my side. Yes.
But you're a military guy, so you can
The current priority of Mr. Jokowi's administration is actually to focus on infrastructures, to speed up those infrastructures which can enhance the prosperity of the people, and connectivity So it's about the spread out of even economic resources to all the islands of Indonesia, and that also have absorbed the energy and resources of Indonesia. Not to say that Indonesia have loosened up on their efforts uh, uh, to to pay to the assertiveness of ASEAN leadership, but ASEAN is still the cornerstone of Indonesian foreign policy. It's just a matter of priority of the current administration. Mhm. And maybe just like in the US, I think between Indonesia and the US, we have very much in common. We have one of the largest democracy. Even the vice foreign minister said that Indonesia has the largest democracy of its percentage of turnout in the election compared to the US. But again, it is a presidential cabinet system. So everything would very much influenced by the priority that has been set by the president. But again, ASEAN, I can assure you, is still the cornerstone of the Indonesian foreign policy. Yes. What is missing in the U.S. Indonesia project, and one of the things that I can mention here is the integration and comprehensiveness of the project involving the duet between Indonesia, Japan, and Australia. And what were the other questions?
Well,
sir?
Foreign fighters.
Foreign fighter issue.
Oh, yes.
Was this a good or bad, what are the risks of keeping
yes.
the foreign fighters out of Indonesia? Because they're
Yes.
still Indonesian and they're, former ISIS members or maybe current ISIS members
Yes.
and other combatants.
Yes.
And yet your government has just decided this past week not to allow them
Right.
to repatriate.
Right. Public opinion has been divided, but can be put into details, meeting into the anatomy of those public opinion. One is that there is that legalistic and security approach to the issue. And secondly is the humanitarian approach to the issue. The security and legalistic approach would tend to go into the direction as to not to receive the returning foreign fighters. At those people who were actually have reached or entered the status of foreign fighters, because legalistically it is said in the bill that citizens will not be accepted as citizens if they voluntarily give up Indonesian citizenship, and the foreign fighters I think voluntarily give up Indonesian citizenship. And also in the bill, it says that Indonesia shall not accept citizenship for those former citizens who have fought for foreign military forces. Now, it is debatable whether the military wing of the ISIS can be interpreted as military wing of a foreign state or as a military force, but that is the reality. But in the end, even if we have had not the foreign fighters, we have already problems with terrorism from within Indonesia. So if we receive those the return of those foreign fighters, it would add to the security risk of domestic Indonesia. As to pay concern to the humanitarian issue, there is also that public opinion that we shall accept the children and the women who were forced to go to Syria outside their consent, and that there is a debate, and I think it's coming into an agreement that those criteria of former Indonesian citizens can be accepted to return to Indonesia. And what else?
Well, I think we're out of time. This has been the best discussion I can remember, with Indonesia-U.S. at the center of discussion. And I know when I invited, when Pak Ferry reached out and said that you were coming to town, Pak Agus, I mean, we were very excited. And when I asked Randy whether he'd be willing to join, on Valentine's Day in particular, he said he couldn't think of a better thing to do on Valentine's. So when I was coming back,
Don't tell
you're right. Joe Filter said he'd missed the last 2 Valentine's Day because he was working so hard for this guy. But I came back from Paris last night, and having talked about a free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific, they were very excited in Europe about that. But I wanted to at least bring you a small token while we wait for the major infrastructure.
Thank you.
A Valentine's Day.
Is it today? Is it today?
It is today, yes. So our heart goes out to you in Indonesia. Thank you, Randy. Thank you.
Shall I give you a kiss?
No. But please thank our speakers. Thank you.